Okay, colleagues, colleagues here in the room as well, colleagues in the sky. I know there's a camera over there. You might not see the entire room, but I can ensure you that we've got pleasant company here. My name is Andreas. As you can see, I'm asked to moderate this wonderful session that we have here today. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome you on behalf of my team, the team of the Independent Evaluation Unit, but also on behalf of the Secretariat of the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, to this event here where we, as the title says, and the title is clearly the program, we would like to address the following two questions. Where is the GCF and where does the fund intend to go? So for this, we have a wonderful panel sitting here to my right. One on the very far right, Dr. Archie Rastogi, the IU's Chief Evaluation Advisor, as well as to my closer right, Selina Ryder, the Head of Policy and Strategy of the GCF. So both panelists have brought with them a very brief presentation to briefly look at the evaluative evidence and findings and recommendations that we have from the second performance review, a review that was completed by the Independent Evaluation Unit last year and brought forward to the first board meeting in 2023. And then we also got a presentation by Selina on the outline of the updated strategic plan of the GCF for the period 2024-27. So, but that's not enough. We hope that we'll also be able to engage a little bit with you on your questions there, here in the room as well as up in the sky, your thoughts, your reflections to what you've heard and seen, and perhaps also any type of further reflections for the future. Before I turn over to our colleagues here, I was wondering if we could do since we're a smaller group, just a brief introduction, just to hear a little bit who's in the room. So I might go with Pacifica first, as she's sitting to my furthest right, but still the closest.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Pacifica Ogola from Kenya, and I'm an alternate board member. But I'm coming to this meeting as a friend of the Secretariat and of the
Thank you. I'm Tara Daniel with the Women's Environment and Development Organization. I'm an observer with the GCF Observer Network of Civil Society, Indigenous Peoples, and local communities.
Hello, I'm Martin Nolze. I'm Senior Evaluator at the German Institute for Development Evaluation, so an evaluation institute just located around the corner here at the city of Bonn. And I'm happy that we shared a few steps of IEU GCF in the past, and I'm curious now, where are you heading to? What are the next steps? Thank you.
Thanks, colleagues. That's really delightful. So we've got one more person to just come into the room here. Perhaps you want to briefly say a few words about yourself. Just find us a quick spot. We'll give you a couple of minutes before we turn maybe to the sky, just to see a little bit who is there. Or maybe you want to put it in the chat. Those people that sit here online in the chat, to quickly say who you are. But maybe we have had already our round. Maybe you just want to briefly introduce yourself. Where are you from?
Thank you. Thank you for invitation. My name is Dastan Abduldaev. I came from Kyrgyzstan. Currently, I'm Climate Vulnerable Forum Capacity Building Fellow on Global Climate Policy and Diplomacy. In 2021-22, I was Director of Climate Finance Center of Kyrgyzstan. Then I serve as a focal point for GCF and UNFCCC and other climate-related institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So you see already, colleagues, we have quite a variety. We've got evaluators, but we've also got friends who are also board members or alternate board members. We've got the civil society. We've got country focal points. So Jeremy, thanks for coming. We just had a little round because we're very few people. Just have a short introduction, your name, perhaps your affiliation. If you wanted to do, please go ahead and have the mic.
Thank you, and hi everyone. My name is Jeremy Anderson. I work for the International Transport Workers Federation. So we're part of the Tungo trade union group, And we're very focused this year on the NCQG negotiations. So that's us. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's really lovely to hear from you. And then just in the sky, I saw Yara from the UNFCCC Secretariat of the Climate Finance team. So great to have you as well, Yara. So it's quite a diverse group of friends here of the GCF. So let's delve right into. So hello and good afternoon. Great to have you here as well. We've just done a little round of introduction. We'll come back to you after the presentation. We'll just start off with the presentation from Archie. So Archie, the floor is yours on some of the reflections on the second performance review before we turn over to the Secretariat with Selina to really walk through what we would see for the future. Over to you.
Thank you, Andres. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in this company, to be able to talk to all of you about the second performance review of the GCF. Just a quick background on what this is. So the board of the GCF launched the second performance review, SPR, for the remainder of this conversation 2 years ago in June 2021. Actually, to the day, possibly. The board asked us to determine the scope of the scope. The board gave us a scope. It was to assess the progress made by the GCF in its mandate over that strategic period, and the performance of the GCF in delivering the paradigm shift. That's the GCF's mandate. The final report of the evaluation we submitted to the board in March, which the board took note of, along with the management response that Selina will talk about in a few minutes. So that's the policy background in the institution where it sits. And I'll present to you some of the findings and recommendations from this final report. But before that, just what did we do? So over the 2 years, we did a lot of work. This was a very, very large team of, at times, 17 to 20 people, sometimes less, sometimes more. And we used a lot of standard evaluation methods of a mixed methods approach to do an analysis of documents firstly. So we looked at virtually everything that the board had ever considered during GCF1, almost every document. We did a systematic literature review about where the GCF is and climate finance. We did a landscape analysis to put GCF into context with other agencies, an online survey on governance, which we specially reached board members and senior members of the GCF management. Data analysis by the IU's Data Lab, including a special focus on gender as well, which we looked at specifically, and more than 700 interviews, about 750 interviews, including the Secretariat, the board, UNFCCC Secretariat, NDAs, entities, and so on. And in fact, we interviewed a lot of you in the room or your colleagues as well. We also undertook 12 country case studies, which was quite a large number for us. So Bangladesh, Georgia, Grenada, India, Kenya, Maldives, Mauritius, Morocco, Peru, Rwanda, Solomon Islands, and Vietnam. Some of them started virtually because we still were affected by COVID. And then we moved to in-person case studies where it was possible, which also quite helped us. Now, to come to the meat of the conversation. So we have 4 chapters in the report, which cover 4 key questions that we looked at. And I'll cover 4 of them very, very quickly. Firstly, institutional architecture and performance, which is a euphemism for governance. Because when we started this review, governance was a key question that the board asked us to look at, and it also came up as a very important question in the stage of GCF at that time. But the good news is we found no insurmountable challenges facing the governance of the GCF. We found that the governance is performing as it should, and it faces some challenges in that the GCF actually had made a lot of progress during GCF1. The board had approved the IRMF, the USP, etc. There were some challenges, such as slow policy work and differences in strategic vision among the different members of the GCF board. And to come together as a cohesive unit, as a board, and deliver that view, that was a bit slow. But comparable to other institutions, the story is that the GCF is founded in, established in, and resembles the culture of the UNFCCC. So the speed of the GCF's decision-making resembles that of the decision-making in the UNFCCC. And but the governance also has a lot of legitimacy because there are 24 board members, 12 from developed, 12 from developing countries, and that brings a lot of legitimacy to the board of the GCF, but it compromises some compromises on efficiency there. There's some areas for strengthening we identify in the report, which include accountability, so CSO representation and how that's taken into account in the consideration by the GCF, the observer inputs, and gender balance in the board and within the board and on its various committees. One of the things we highlight, the report highlights, is the responsibility between governance and management, and the functions are often blurred, and that distinction, we say in the recommendations, would help. At the country level, we find that the GCF has a position of privilege. Because the GCF is a large provider of climate finance, for many countries, it is a very important partner. But the strategic positioning of the GCF on its partnerships is not yet fully developed. So for some countries, it's a provider of climate finance. But there's still insufficient clarity on what the GCF intends to do. Is it a partner in climate finance? Is it only a provider of climate finance? Does it only fill gaps in climate finance at the countries, or is it going to be an active partner at the country level? That vision we find in the report is not completely clear yet. So there is a need for clarity in the roles that the GCF may wish to play at the country level, and these can include many roles. It can build capacities. It can fulfill climate finance gaps. It can be a partner in planning for climate finance, not just from the GCF, but from other sources as well. And all these kinds of roles are not contradictory to each other or mutually exclusive. But that clarity, we find, is would be quite useful. The second chapter relates to access to the GCF, looking at accreditation primarily, and many of these findings are quite well aligned with previous work of the IU. So firstly, we say that the network of the GCF until that time has developed a very diverse network of partners, 114 as of this report, and probably more now, which cover various sizes, various scopes in different parts of the world. But we state that there's still a need for a vision and a strategy on what accreditation means and the purpose it wishes to serve within the GCF, and how to manage that very capable and diverse set of entities in the GCF. Depending on who you speak to in the GCF, accreditation serves many different purposes. It serves a purpose for capacity building. It's supposed to find entities that are channels of climate finance. It's supposed to be direct access, and so there can be multiple goals emphasized or not directly stated within the policy documents, but they are implied in the GCF. The alternatives to accreditation we state in the report are not fully explored, and capacity challenges do remain. Many entities do still face the challenges of, for instance, implementing projects, even if they get accredited. Excuse me. Direct access is an emphasis in the GCF. It's growing. We find that there is a growing number of entities that are direct access entities, but it's limited because of two factors. One, countries struggle to find and to nominate, to identify the right entities, and then entities struggle to get nominated, to get accreditation. And then there are a number of means put in place at the secretariat level, and international entities are also meant to provide support for capacity development, but these efforts are yet to show results systematically. The process of accreditation is still perceived to be protracted, inefficient, and it's not sufficiently differentiated by entity characteristics and not yet optimized for direct access. Excuse me. Thank you. The next chapter looks at programming in the GCF. We find that upstream programming is critical. So the GCF has used many means, for instance, country programs, entity work programs, and other means to establish that upstream country programming. But the best pathways to do this are still being established. The GCF has since experimented with a different approach to country programming, for instance. In terms of planning tools, it's still insufficiently focused to achieve the full potential of country programming. Again, this relates to the role GCF wishes to play at the country level, and what it would support and what it would not. That support still needs clarity. In terms of the process through which FPs go before they're approved, the growing volumes of pipeline. We've seen evidence of process improvements and increasing quality at entry of FPs that come to the GCF. But the process is still widely perceived as bureaucratic, lengthy, inconsistent, and non-transparent. Although the time taken for approval has reduced over GCF1, but the perception still remains that it is a lengthy process. In terms of risk results on risk management, we find that the approach is still underdeveloped. The board has approved the IRMF, but it was still not operationalized at the time of this review. And delegation of risk is not yet quite clear, at least at the time of this report. And the risk management approach of the GCF is not fully reconciled with the diversity of projects the GCF undertakes or supports and the diversity of entities that undertake that. So the risk culture is a little bit still limited within the GCF. On knowledge management, we find this report states that the knowledge management function is not fully institutionalized for thought leadership, which, excuse me, is part of the GCF's mandate. And finally, results and impacts of the GCF investments. There's been a lot of interest in what the impacts of GCF have been, what the GCF has supported, and whether the finance is reaching the grounds. And this was one of the questions that the GCF, that this review looks at. At the beginning, we looked at the progress the GCF was likely to make by the end of the strategic period on its stated goals in the USP, the updated strategic plan. And so I'll just give you a brief summary, the top 2 points, which is that the GCF would be unlikely to meet, in our assessment, would be unlikely to meet the adaptation allocation target and the private sector facility targets. So those are 2 targets that the GCF would be unlikely to miss by the end of the year. But we've seen improvements in speed and predictability of the process, which was a target in the USP. So mixed performance on the USP as projected by the IU. In terms of impact, a lot of projects are under implementation, of course, and we find that the projects that were approved in GCF in the IRM period are obviously more advanced in terms of implementation, because it takes projects up to 2 to 3 years to actually get started on implementation. We also find that mitigation projects are far more advanced in implementation, the ones that are, and we had access to about 30 to 40 impact evaluation, interim evaluation assessment reports, and most of them are stated in self-assessments do meet the quality. So the GCF looks like the modest climate impacts at the project level, and many results may be forthcoming. Co-finance, which is expected of GCF projects, we find that it's not consistent with the expectations that the projects make, the expectations that the projects claim at the time of approval. So that result is a bit inconsistent. In terms of results management, the approach of the GCF is still underdeveloped, and it's still to demonstrate results. The IRMF, as I said, was not yet operational at the time of this review. And on 3 key questions, co-finance, gender, and indigenous peoples engagement, we find that the GCF has made progress in GCF1 in different ways, but because of the IRMF, the stage at which the IRMF is, there's limited precision when it comes to results. So we're not able to say with precision what the results might be on those 3 dimensions. The key recommendations that this report makes, it makes 7 recommendations, and we've got them verbatim here for policy reasons, of course. So the first one relates to the strategic vision of the GCF and the strategic plan. And the report says that the GCF should clarify this fund's strategic positioning and articulate the programming and operational priorities. Basically, this recommendation says that the GCF should clarify what it wishes to do and what it will not do, and that position should become very clear to all the partners of the GCF, and that clarity is quite essential, and it will cascade down into operational priorities as well, which we'll come to in a minute. The second recommendation is at the country level. The GCF should clarify the role it wishes to play. So it should clarify its intended approach and possible roles, aligning with the available resources. So it should be quite realistic to the resources it has. In GCF1, we find that there's a lot of claim to do a lot of different kinds of things, but there are limitations to resources. There are limitations to what the GCF can do. And we're recommending to be realistic about those resources and what they might allow the GCF to achieve. In the third recommendation, we're talking about accreditation priorities. So the GCF should support and explore other access mechanisms beyond accreditation. It should also build capacities for better access and country-owned FP development and enhance the accreditation process and efficiency and transparency. The fourth recommendation relates to improving the operational systems. So continue to improve the efficiency, predictability, and relevance of the operational systems, ensuring that they reflect policy priorities, strategic objectives, and climate urgency, especially targeting the delays within the GCF's control. So if you take recommendation 1, that would provide the GCF with strategic clarity, and that would cascade down into improvements in the operational priorities. Because what we find in this report is that the GCF wishes to do everything all at once. So all the processes are not optimized necessarily to one purpose, but are catering to many different purposes at the same time. And this can be improved with strategic clarity and a clear strategic vision. Number 5, we're recommending for the GCF to pivot from an approvals orientation to one that emphasizes results and learning with a coherent results architecture for GCF2. So after the board approves a USP, hopefully this summer, then there might be a need to revise the results management architecture and to make that aligned with the USP that's approved by or updated by the board at that time. Number 6, the GCF should urgently clarify the approach to managing entity and project risks for funded activities and RPSP grants. So develop the results management framework that's aligned with the GCF realities. And finally, we recommend strengthening governance processes to provide more efficient and effective leadership for the fund. We have a number of recommendations there, including informals for the board and increasing the social capital among the members of the board, which can help enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of the board as it makes its decisions and provides guidance to the GCF, especially the strategic guidance. So those are the 7 recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Archie. Again, as you can see, colleagues, quite in-depth presentation that followed a very in-depth assessment of what is the performance of the GCF, what can we learn. And I know we have got a very diverse group. So we've just had, for those that just recently joined, we in the beginning, we had a little introduction just to get to know each other a little bit. We've got people from the country, representing the country. We've got the CSOs, we've got board represented. So it's quite interesting for us as well to hear a little bit from your thoughts later on, to see how these things may align with your thinking, if you had any additional thoughts on what your direction may have been, or maybe what you would wish for the fund to consider. This has been obviously quite eye-opening. I've one thing that I noted down, and I just wanted to say this here. You know, this question of finding your true purpose. You can't do all at once. You need to start focusing on the things that are in reach, but that also are interesting for the fund and for the vision of the fund. That means we need to tackle trade-offs. We need to think about the trade-offs that are there, and we need to tackle them. And that requires a lot from the board as well, and the stakeholder in the GCF ecosystem to understand this positioning that the GCF wants to have. A second thought that came out from the presentation is obviously this question of how can we make that matter at the country level. So what sort of role would the GCF then play at the country level with all its different instruments and modalities at its disposal? Without further reflections on this, but just to give you some food for thought, let's turn over to the Secretariat to actually hear what the vision has been and the discussions have been with the board so far, to highlight the insights in the management response on the second performance, but perhaps also hear a little bit of where the Secretariat might think of going. Selina, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas and Archie. And it is nice to have this conversation in a small group of friends. Also, thank you, of course, to the IEU for the invitation to present, and for the huge body of work that went into this. It is actually difficult to appreciate when you see the final report just how many hours of labor, how much thinking went into generating this product. I think I'm not sure how unique we are, but certainly our governing instrument says we will be a continuously learning institution. I'm not sure how many funds governing instrument actually says that. And so we take the learning task very seriously. And I think we're always very appreciative of the insights that come from the evaluation unit, and particularly through these major exercises, which are the performance reviews done once every programming period. If you flick on to the next slide, sorry, there's no flicker, I guess. So Archie, thanks for tag teaming. Maybe you can actually just flick all the way through the animations. Before coming sort of to the management's perspective on what Archie has just presented, I wanted to put up this overall slide on the evolution of the GCF. There's a lot of words here, but one thing that I actually like to impress upon people, because it was told to me once and it was a light bulb moment, is we had to build this institution from absolute scratch. So the UNFCCC created the fund. Expectations on it were super high, basically to start delivering, start programming as soon as possible, getting that funding to developing countries. But unlike our sister funds, the Adaptation Fund and GCF, we were actually hosted within the World Bank, so within an existing infrastructure. We literally started building our entire infrastructure from the ground up. And so we're actually only just, you'll see the first two blocks there, and our initial resource mobilization, creating the building blocks, and GCF1 aligning the building blocks. We've really only just come to the end of that build period, where we were very much putting in place policies, putting in place processes, putting in place the way we do programming. And we are now just about reaching that point in organizational maturity, where we're turning to knowing who we are. That was the question of today. Knowing who we are and starting to work out how we can learn and do better at what we're doing. And I think just a couple of other things to note on this slide. You know, in our very first programming period, we had far more resource than projects. That is very much not the case anymore. Going into this next programming, we're going into our replenishment. We've got a replenishment this year. So basically we run out of our current funds this year. We'll be fundraising for next year. Going into that replenishment, we already have over $7 billion in advanced pipeline. That's advanced pipeline. We've got another $20 billion. That's the total, well, $20 billion total concept notes and funding proposals. And then if you go into country programs and the sort of longer pipeline, up to $40 billion. So that's the kind of a scenario we're facing. We have also changed the way a bit we do business. And this comes to some of the recommendations as well. So in the first period, we really were a co-financier. We took the projects from our partners and looked at how we could bring GCF finance into them. Within this period, we're doing much more of a sort of co-investor role, where we look at the respective strengths of ourselves and our partners who we're funding with and how that funding can complement. And we do see the potential, because we are at this partnership hub going forward, to actually be even more active in trying to build coalitions to bring financing behind developing countries' mitigation and adaptation ambitions. So sorry I spent a bit of time on that first slide, but I thought helpful to give a bit of the big picture, the sort of 10,000 foot context before we jump into the recommendations. But Archie, if you can help with the next slide. What I'm going to do now is just go through each of the IU's recommendations one by one. So I won't read the recommendation out again because Archie's just gone through them. But the first one, which relates to strategic vision, from the Secretariat's perspective, at least, we fully agree with this recommendation that the GCF can more clearly define its strategic vision, its programming directions, as well as address some of those trade-offs. And I think we know that with the current targets that have been set by the board, so there's 50-50 balance mitigation adaptation, there's a share to direct access, a share to private sector, a share of adaptation funding. We know that we ourselves have to go through a complex modeling exercise to work out what exactly that means for the portfolio. So that means that that's not particularly transparent or predictable to anyone else out there. So there's absolutely improvement that the fund can do in that regard. This being said, and I think it's important to recognize, this is something that is very much in the board's hands. So the Secretariat is providing advice to the board on this. Just to give a couple of examples, and actually I meant to pick up at the outset, one of the good things that sometimes evaluations challenge you to get better. One of your findings, I think, said that we would not meet the adaptation allocation. Depending on your definition of meet, we're actually at 51% adaptation right now. So we've come from a bit behind actually to shift our programming towards adaptation. And so that's the current portfolio status. But the example I was going to use was actually on the private sector, where the evaluation also said the fund won't meet its private sector target, which was to sort of, it's actually 30% in grant equivalence. And the trade-off there is we have actually increased the share of nominal funding going to the private sector relatively significantly. We have not increased it in grant equivalence because there's a trade-off with the type of instrument. So we've actually been doing more equity, more guarantees, but that is generally sort of less grant equivalent, right? So even though we're de-risking the transactions, we're not getting toward that target. So that was an example of where the board would really need to consider which way it wants to set the target to incentivize us to act in a certain way. And that's what we're doing right now, and Pacific has just rejoined us, but in her friend hat, is really advising the board on some of those considerations around strategy setting, around the resourcing, around feasibility, around trade-offs. And we hope that that decision will come at the next board meeting. So for the next recommendation, this is really around country engagement, and this is a really big focus for us now as well. In parallel with preparing the updated strategic plan, we've also been preparing an update to the fund's readiness strategy, so readiness and preparatory support program. And this is really looking at that question of, firstly, where are the intervention points where countries need us to come to support NDC, NAP and long-term strategy implementation? And we have tried to develop a sort of an implementation framework, an investment sort of framework schematic, which then helps make a little bit more structured and predictable where then are the needs, where are the barriers, and where can GCF come in and support? So because different countries will have different entry points. So that's one initiative there. And then within the readiness program itself, looking at how we can actually update the modalities to be a bit more fit for purpose. So be a bit more flexible in terms of the support provided to countries. Actually proposing to have a dedicated support window for direct access entities, so they don't have to go into the country allocation, and also looking at further support for the national adaptation planning process. So that's all on the table, again, for the board's consideration. And I think we would also put forward in the strategic plan this idea of actually sort of fleshing out a partnerships strategy, so we can talk a bit more explicitly about the different ways that, that GCF can engage countries. To the next recommendation, number 3, this is really on accreditation. So the board did adopt an accreditation strategy. Now it was late last year, which does provide us, which we're trying basically to implement now, does provide us some steer, both in terms of management of the accreditation pipeline, as well as support for accredited entities to actually program. And the direct access window I just mentioned is one of the concrete sort of initiatives tied to that. There is, let me say, there is still some outstanding matters for the board to consider here. We hear the very high expectations on accreditation. I think, we know every country is very keen to have a direct access entity. We know that the challenges basically because there is a huge number of entities in the pipeline. On the converse side, the challenge we have is we now have about 120 entities. We're capable of programming about 150 funding proposals every cycle. So you can do the maths. How much more can the GCF actually increase its accreditation network while maintaining enough of an incentive for entities to actually come and be able to program with us each programming cycle? And this is where we also now have a project-specific assessment approach, which allows entities to come with a one-off project. But we're also trying to be a bit more explicit about other ways that partners can engage the fund. So they may actually be able to engage as an executing entity, an implementing entity, a contracted partner, a delivery partner within an existing accredited entity's proposal, and that can still offer some of the capacity, and institutional benefits for delivering climate finance. So some considerations there. I think I can probably move on to the next one. In parallel to that, we have done some updates to the accreditation framework itself, which are designed to streamline. But if we can go maybe to recommendation 4 and 5, which are getting more into the operational and institutional side of things. So improving efficiency, predictability, and relevance of operational systems. This is something where in the proposed strategic plan, we're actually embedding an operational priority focused on significantly improving access. So that's our proposed response on this one. And then basically a number of pillars: predictability, speed, harmonization with other funds, sort of volume, that would be looking at tackling the access and efficiency questions. In terms of the approval orientation, moving more towards results, I think that again sort of reflects where we are in our overall organizational journey. Our portfolio is actually still maturing. It's still at a relatively early stage of implementation. But as we go further, we will get more results and be able to feed that back, hopefully, into learning and into this process, such as the global stocktake process. And then for the last couple of recommendations, Archie, if you can help flick to the next slide. In terms of both risk management as well as governance, What we've done this time around is we have a much slimmer set of institutional priorities for our replenishment process. Because of that organizational maturity, the areas of work here have narrowed relative to where we were in the last programming process. But we've been doing a lot of work as a secretariat to update our risk management practices and tools. And then, of course, look at how we can, as a secretariat, better support governance. So enhance that support to the board for its decision making, and particularly on the policy front. So if we can flick on, I'm conscious to kind of conclude soon, so there's enough time for an exchange. If you can flick through this slide, this just very quickly shows the structure of the strategic plan is still under discussion, but how this kind of lines up with the potential structure we'd be looking at in the strategic plan. So really defining out with more clarity that overall strategic vision, as well as some specific programming goals. And the board's intent is to look at more concrete, quantifiable climate result-oriented goals for the next programming period. We then, as mentioned, have that real focus on strengthening country implementation and investment capacity, which would be embedded within the strategic plan. And then the operational priority on enhancing access, which takes those recommendations sort of 3 and 4, and then the institutional priorities, which would cover off the recommendations 5, 6, and 7. And maybe just to close off, again, with a slightly bigger picture view, you know, what we hope all of this means is that the Green Climate Fund can really continue to serve as the flagship fund for this convention, for helping developing countries implement their NDCs and NAPs, and that we're committed to do that both through enhancing access. So we want to look at that really, really seriously and do everything that we can, but also enhancing results. And that's where that strategic focus on more on climate results and on addressing some of those trade-offs and questions comes in. And the final point, I think this is a really nice one to end on to being in Bonn, being outside of Songdo, is one thing that's a much stronger focus in this strategic planning process relative to the last one, is looking outside. So looking to our partnerships, looking to our country partners, trying to be closer to our country partners, looking to our entity and delivery partners and trying to be close to them, and really thinking about how we can collaborate better and work in better complementarity and coherence. So I think that's maybe a nice note to end on, Archie and Andreas, and hand back to you.
Oh, thanks, Selina. Again, very interesting also to hear from you on the response to the review, but also to see a little bit of where we're going with this. As the question said, you know, where does the fund intend to go? Again, just it was great to see a little bit the historical development of the institution. Also, historically speaking, we came from an institution that wasn't there before. We needed to build it from scratch, as you said. It was this consideration of course, we recognize we've been perhaps a co-financier in the beginning. We're moving slowly to being co-investor, as you said, and then even the last one, I put it down, building coalitions, yeah, being the partner, the true partner in the countries. That's something that's definitely interesting to see. Also, when you came to the country perspective, to talk a little bit about where are the connection points, where are the entry points for the GCF, and how can we identify that, and how we can then perhaps look at a more strategic, maybe a misuse of the word strategic, but more of a strategic perspective and consideration of our PSP, and how does that fit into the perspective of the countries. And lastly, of course, as you said, the question of access. We have only finite resources, or hopefully a good replenishment with some resources that can be used. But that also means, where are we going with access? Where are we going with accreditation? That requires a rethink. It requires an assessment of what else can be done with the fund. And here we come to this partnership question that you came to. Lastly, you mentioned, you know, pivoting towards results and learning. Yes. It's definitely something the Secretariat is thinking about. The fund as such is thinking and linking the global stock take as well as other learning opportunities to see what we can feed back. Colleagues, we've had a very intimate group in the beginning where we even went around and introduced ourselves to each other. I don't think that's possible anymore. But anyways, just to reflect a little bit, we've got representation through, you know, friends that are also board members or alternate board members. We've got CSO representation. We've got people from the countries, national focal points that are represented here. We've got others as well that that came into this climate finance discussion as well as evaluators. Shouldn't forget that as well. What does that make you think? Any questions from the audience on what has been said, where we've come from with the bulk of evidence here? Any thoughts and reflections on where the GCF is intending to go? Perhaps also from the CSO's perspective, we've seen that there's been some reflections that the precision is not there when we think about indigenous peoples, civil society organizations in the countries, as well as observers. The precision for GCF, or from the GCF's perspective, is not there in results, to bringing these results clearly out. That's what we're finding in the report. Is that anything? Is that triggering anything? I'll give you a second to think about it. I should also highlight that you do have a chance to get coffee if you feel a little bit lightheaded here. We do have coffee. We do have some little snippets. Yes, go ahead.
Dear colleagues, Lynn, Archie, Andrew, thank you very much for your constant help to the developing countries, member countries. And one thing is clear, that GCF as an organization teaching us, especially represented from developing countries, to broader concept, right? What is climate finance, how to develop, how to interact with international donors or multilateral development banks. From my personal experience, I didn't have any other such kind of, entity, international entity, which taught us how to develop projects, how to interact, how to learn, or how to, advance in different kind of actions. That's why thank you for your broad mandate. I think it's one of those unique mandates which you have, even though that you have limited sources, limited capacity, but that mandate which you provide to representative from, especially from developing countries, is huge. That's why thank you for that mandate, for your job. What are you doing? So my question, I have several questions. For example, currently we are discussing different kind of innovative finance, right? I'm wondering which kind of innovative source of innovative finance GCF has in a coming, or GCF2 period, right? In order to be aware and then try to take part in those innovative financing possibilities. The second question is about accreditation. I'm wondering, is there any policy in GCF that, for example, you have, GCF has sister organization like Adaptation Fund, GF, especially if, for example, one organization which will be accredited in GCF and will go to Adaptation Fund to accredited over there as well. Is there any restriction, or how you elaborate such kind of activity if one organization will have several accreditation in several institutions? And my last question is about, I already started about climate investment plan. It's huge and strategic new document. It's more or less unknown still, the mandate, goal, and how it will align with existing country programming. It should be replaced or complementary to each other. And if I may, one additional question on, you started to talk about country level engagement, GCF. I'm wondering how GCF can coordinate activities, all those MDBs in country level. Is there any possibilities? Because country level coordination is rely on mainly to countries right now, right? At the same time, taking into account that, broad mandate of GCF for coming years to try to be partner for all multinational development bank and development partners. Is there any tool or plan to coordinate those things within each country, if I may? Thank you very much.
Excellent to have so many questions from the ground. It's really, revealing that obviously there's a lot of questions, but also a lot of positives that something has happened. We were there, we were able to convey some messages. Jeremy, I see your hand, yes.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to hear about the review and to have this discussion. And yeah, my question relates to a couple of the findings, perhaps the most on the ones on learnings and also those on governance. And you won't be surprised to hear me say on the subject of just transition. Very pleased that this has got quite a high profile at these SBs, or at this SB, but also I think this, in terms of the discussions amongst parties so far, there's probably still a fair degree of confusion or lack of common ground in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about just transition. And I think that is partly because we need to kind of show the concrete examples. And I think when we look at the universe of of MDBs, of climate finance institutions, we're starting to see some good policies that are being developed, but where we're lacking is more on good examples on the implementation side. And so I'm thinking, particularly representing the trade unions, but other stakeholders are important as well, in terms of examples where you really follow through on a particular projects, representing transport workers. In my world, that's things like funding for workers to get access to electric minibuses in the global south, funding for seafarer training on the new generation of zero carbon ships, and moving beyond having the policy, but making sure that you have that genuine tripartite engagement right throughout the whole process. So I'm very interested in reflections you may have on how the GCF can lead on showing how this can be done.
Yeah, excellent point, Jeremy. Again, good to have the trade unions also come on with these questions, these sorts of questions, very, very pertinent for the work of the GCF. We'll go to these questions in a short second, just to see, I see another hand up there in the back. If you wanted to come forward, Jeremy, of course, after.
I was just observing the entire presentations. Firstly, congratulations to Dr. Archie for the remarkable work you have done. But I still need to go through the report. My question was that you were talking about, in one of the recommendations, you were saying that you have challenges in terms of co-financing. In some places. So what are those challenges, and how does GCF basically work to, mitigate those challenges? Because I do understand that GCF has been working in several verticals. So how do you basically see yourself out in this chief evaluation advisor?
Thanks for that. That's an excellent question. Jeremy, we'll take you and then we'll go to the answer. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Archie, Selina, and Andreas for your presentation. It's very useful, especially for me, I think. I believe that, well, I'm still learning the GCF process, so I think it takes some time to really engage with all the processes that are going on. And I believe that I have a few comments and then a question. That I believe that the new strategic plan is a great opportunity to really have the clarities that we need, especially that, how we can fulfill the ultimate goal of the GCF. I think that's very important, and in this regard make a lot of sense for me. One of the recommendations that was highlighted recently in the presentation about what the fund could do and what not, and I think that's very important to know in order to not create fake expectations for the countries. And then if I must choose just one or the most important challenge from the country perspective, I think that will be the access, which include the access modalities and accreditation process. So I see that this was already in your presentation, so that's good. And finally, what we have heard from our NDAs, I'm from Chile and also represented from GRULAC, and also I'm alternate board member, so probably I should say that before. And so what they say to me is that it doesn't make too much sense to spend too much time learning how to deal with the GCF. So they spend too much time like trying to understand how the process works and that kind of thing. So my question will be that we can address that with related with capacity building, or is this more connected with the simplification of the GCF process? So that will be my question, or maybe both. So that is, thank you.
Jaime, thanks. You're absolutely right. A good question to ask. Is it capacity that we need, or is it just simplified to make it quicker and more catchable and tangible for us? Colleagues, over to you. I just we've got a couple of comments on the question of the broader mandate, so the innovation in finance. Maybe we can speak to that from both from evaluation perspectives, but also from Secretariat if possible. Accreditation and policies and sister organization, what to do, what not to do. Is there something? And then of course the climate investment plans. What is it? Where does it go? How does that link to country cooperation? That was one of the first. Jeremy had this question on governance and learning, just transition, the question of examples for just transition. That is an opportunity there. Challenges of co-finance we've heard is definitely something. And Jaime, the question here around the problems on access is a question of capacity or simplification. Maybe Archie, if you want to take a few and then we go over to Selina, if that's okay.
Great, thank you for the questions. I'll leave the questions about the future of the GCF to Selina. Of course, that's not my space to address those questions, but I'll try and cover some of the questions that relate to what we found. And of course, this is a conversation between friends. So now I'm going a little bit outside of what we know in the report, but sort of my personal reflections as well. I also should say that, of course, I'm representing a team here, but it's a very big, large team that undertook this massive piece of work. So I should acknowledge those, and the colleagues have delivered a massive amount of work, exemplary amount of work with a high degree of professional conduct. So, so that I should acknowledge as well. On where should I start? So governance as well. Governance. That was one of my favorite things in this report, because that's an area that I understood the least, and frankly, that was an area that I was a bit skeptical of what we might find as we were going into the report. The GCF in GCF1, let's recognize a couple of things. One was COVID. So every meeting was virtual, which means you didn't see people face to face and you had to interact with a screen. So we could see that board members were having difficulties talking to each other. In GCF1, GRULAC was, for most of GCF1, GRULAC wasn't nominated, and we didn't have members from a whole constituency. So that's another challenge in representation and in getting that balance on the board. Board members in our survey were so hard on themselves on the performance, on their own performance in giving GCF strategic direction. And yet we find that it's all coming together now. One of the things that we quoted, and I'm quoting Daniel's paper in the report, which talks about how the characteristics of a delegation and what those characteristics are, and that allow delegations to participate in a meeting. And if I'm remembering it right, those are background in ability to work in English, the size of delegation, and qualifications. And that we find relevant for GCF as well, that delegations that have those three capacities are able to engage in the GCF and then contribute to, she's nodding, which means I'm more or less on track. So why I say that is because all of those limitations and those challenges do reflect on the previous USP, where this previous USP we find in our assessment is not a good strategy document. It doesn't provide strategic directions. It just has a list of things that the GCF will do, which is such a broad list that it has a lot of strategic ambiguity, not only in terms of operations, but in terms of priorities, overall organizational, institutional priorities as well. For instance, just transition is actually not stated in the previous USP in that explicit a way, as one might hope now that the future USP may include. So with that ambiguity on just transition, or that limitation on stating just transition so upfront in the organization's mandate, the GCF has a limitation in what it cannot do in this strategic period anyway. This also relates, so let me just reflect a little bit on more of that let's say in the case of South Africa, where GCF is seen, and the case study in a different evaluation, but at the same time states that the GCF is a provider of finance. It fills some of the subsectoral climate priorities, but it's not big enough to actually drive a just transition in the country, at least in the case of South Africa, not yet. As that clarity, that strategy emerges and that clarity emerges, perhaps there is a bigger role for the GCF to play. But as of now, there are limitations in how the GCF is perceived and is tangible at the level of the country. That also relates to the access question, where because there's ambiguity on what access to the GCF means, how it's going to be operationalized, etc., that results in operational ambiguities. We say that in the report. Let's take the process of accreditation. It's meant to do so many things that the process itself is prepared or is not customized to any specific thing, but is prepared to do everything all at once, which results in inefficiencies, and that's quite evident in the GCF. So the recommendation is to create that clarity on what access to the GCF would be, which can then cascade into efficiencies in the processes, operational processes for the GCF, and that can probably make life a little bit easier for the Secretariat as well. And on co-finance. So co-finance, we're stating in the report that at the time of the project submission or the proposal submission of the GCF to the GCF, there are estimates made about potential co-finance for a project. But we find that in the interim evaluations, at least, a lot of the co-finance hasn't actually materialized. There are several possible reasons, and we go into a bit more detail into them in the report, which could include, for instance, delays in the project. So there's so much, many projects have faced so much delay that a lot of the potential co-finances have actually gone away, have disappeared, or their priorities have changed, or the realities of the projects themselves have changed. In many cases, governments have stepped up and stepped into many of these projects as providers of co-finance. But if I recall correctly, there isn't a requirement to produce from potential co-financers at the FP proposal stage on their commitment to co-finance. So that's a limitation, which means a lot of this co-finance doesn't actually materialize during implementation.
Yeah, mostly before. So the delays in the process of getting a board approval for a project. So that's the one. So you could, when that is one of the key periods that we've seen. They're correct. That's correct. But then you obviously go in, if you go, and you see this in the report, if you go through the different stages, there is a diagram that would explain a little bit on average what a project has to go through the different steps, from all the way from submission, but then also board approval, and after board approval, the negotiations of the AFAs, of the FAAs, apologies, of the funding agreements. So that all that process leads always to a question of how is the co-financer positioned to then, in addition to its own plans, be able to fund the project. So that's it. Yeah, please do.
If I can come in, and I know you have to go, so maybe I'll take this one first. But in terms of, yeah, so here I think we were talking about sort of the co-finance in the funding proposal that was approved relative to what materialized afterwards. So what can happen there? So basically the first thing that has to happen is all your project agreements have to be executed. So both with the GCF, but then all your project subsidiary agreements. Then you have to get your people together on the ground and get working, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think what we are seeing from a portfolio perspective is that COVID is still having a massive impact on. So part of it is the process of getting used to, again, the GCF legal agreements. It's kind of like what the colleague was saying, like how much do you invest in getting used to the process, and then once you're used to it, you can make it work faster next time round. But then part of it is actually just this global environment, which has slowed down action, and we see that in our portfolio all the time. The other component that I wanted to layer in from the co-financing side is GCF is meant to be a risk taker. So I'm not sure if these are the exact types of proposals being spoken about, but sometimes, you know, we will put in a riskier tranche of financing for the prospect that other co-financiers will come to that deal, but in trying to get to financial close, it won't necessarily happen. But that's the risk that we take as the fund in actually doing some of these deals where we try to be sort of that first mover or taking the higher risk or more concessional finance to get things going. So that's one dimension there. If I can just go through some of the other questions, maybe this dovetails nicely into sort of the innovative financing question. And I do think that there is I just came from the NDC, Global NDC conference last week. Yeah, exactly. Where one of the key takeaways of the conversation is we really, in the climate community and in the finance community, have to actually get better at talking to each other in a language that communicates to both. And I think this question of actual innovative financing, like what are these financing instruments and structures that people keep talking about, is something where I think GCF has a role to play, but others involved in that overlap have a really important role to play. So what we're kind of talking about here, it can be, and what we're talking about is how do we get as much money as possible flowing to developing countries for their climate commitments? And so it might be something like, you know, we're putting through funds, we're putting equity into very small businesses, so venture businesses or MSMEs. In this case, I'm thinking of the project in East Africa, which is basically giving them the startup capital to get going. You know, and if they can get going, then they can attract, you know, they've got revenue streams, they can attract lending, etc. There are examples, cross-cutting, for example, because one of the questions is how do you get to adaptation, where you might have we've got a funding proposal where there's a revenue stream, but from the mitigation side, from renewable energy, which is being put back into a revolving fund to fund adaptation action. And then there are examples where we're actually providing guarantees to national commercial banks. Again, the one I'm thinking of is in Pakistan with a direct access entity, JS Bank, where we're providing basically a credit guarantee for that bank to do lending to, again, low emission, climate resilient products and services. And that if that takes off, there's actually an opportunity for then the state bank of Pakistan to bundle that into a bond issuance, into capital market issuances. So again, there's some of the examples, but I know that I'm starting to talk financial language already. And one of the key things here is like, how do we actually break that down in terms of being able to sort of talk across the communities as to what the possibilities are. For the accreditation piece, I don't actually think Accreditation Fund and Jeff will accredit any more entities. They're capped. Right. And so most of the entities who are their accredited entities are now our accredited entities, and they benefited from a fast track process. So really what we're talking about here is actually, I think, more the reaccreditation or looking at AE performance side of things as to, is there an opportunity to actually better streamline, harmonize, simplify the requirements on that side? And that's certainly something we can look at. Climate investment plans, I might follow up with you afterwards again. Here, the idea is, you know, you've got the big picture question of implementing an NDC and finding finance, and then you've got the GCF pipeline. And country programs have been the GCF pipeline, but we're trying to find a way, again, working with other financiers to sort of go from that big picture planning process to what then comes to the fund. My computer has just stopped, so I've lost the other questions. In country coordination, look, I'm going to be a little circumspect on this one. We do have to play to our comparative advantages. We're not on ground. And that is one of the distinct disadvantages at the moment, in that we do not have people on ground in the same way that many other development and finance institutions do. And so while we would love to be able to play that sort of collaborating and convening role, I think it's something that we would have to look at sort of on an individual circumstance basis as to whether we are the best placed entity to do that. But of course, what we want to do is to provide the support that empowers the country through NDA and the rest of that architecture, really to be able to take a country ownership through those conversations. On just transition, really good point. I'm under the watchful eye of two members of our board here. So I can say that this is still a really live conversation for our board too, and our board's watching what's going on in UNFCCC, and I think no one really wants to try and get out in front. But what you've just said there of, you know, and we don't yet have examples of just transition within funding proposals, because I think it's still actually too new to have been designed into things. But it's a really good point that if like once we have those concrete examples of showing this is actually what it means and this is what it is done and this is what it looks like in funding terms, that could be quite powerful. And one thing I think, again, as we're thinking through this investment planning piece, and we're working on this with NDC partnership too, but is that question of how do we give guidance on the stakeholder engagement? So of course it's still be countries to do it as they wish, but if we can give guidance sort of on the, okay, so when you're doing your national coordination mechanisms and doing the investment development process, this is kind of what good practice can look like. This is what, you know, examples can look like. That would be that. And then on the last question, yeah, I'm going to take the cop-out answer and say both. It is capacity building and simplification. And part of it is that, you know, it's the regularity of engagement, right? So the more that a country or a partner has a regular engagement with GCF, I think the more that investment is worth it, and the more they're learning and internalizing the knowledge and able to move faster. And so part of this, the direct access window that's being proposed through readiness, is kind of to put that more ongoing capacity in there, so someone can actually learn, take that on board, and then be able to run, move from walk to run. But part of it's simplification as well, and us just, you know, making it easier to navigate, and doing things like looking with our sister funds at, like, can our templates actually be made more similar? So you don't have this different funding proposal templates and completely different reporting templates for different funds, because that confuses everyone.
Just, I know we're at the end of the time, but just, Raimund, just to also respond to you, we're doing a lot of country missions at the moment as the independent evaluation unit for the readiness program, because we're evaluating the readiness program. And one of the key questions that you were asking there is actually been repeatedly said in the mission. So we've seen, I've just come from Cote d'Ivoire, and before there was in Laos, but we've also been to other places where we could clearly see that this question is coming. It's a question of how can we use readiness to really truly embed this climate movement that we have in the country. And that means you to really truly foster the understanding of how can we bring forward climate projects from a country-driven perspective, and how can we enable people to then manage these types of climate finance interventions in the country consistently throughout the process and throughout and sustainably as well throughout the implementation. And what we see here is exactly that question. So do you need to take a lot of time to explain how the GCF is working? Is a one-off good enough? And most often the answer was no. It really needs that repeated, continuous engagement. And then it's obviously also a question of how can we create coherence and complementarity with other actors, because that coherence bit, how do we do coordination at country level across different funds to have a coherent and a complementary approach to climate finance? That's been also some of the reflections that we've got from the countries, which to that extent, I think also responds a little bit to this question of climate investment plans. What can they do? And I think that's been an interesting discussion to see that develop at the same time. Colleagues, I wonder, I just look into the room. Is there any other question? I know there were people in the sky as well. I don't want to forget those. If you have any other reflections, fine. If not, I invite you to take a bite from the few things that we've got here. Have a coffee if you like. We're staying here a little bit. We even have a little video from one of our recent missions that we've just completed right now. Maybe we want to play that one. You can see it. You can listen into. Maybe you have a bite. You can leave if you want as well. You don't. We're not holding you here hostage. But please enjoy. You know, we don't want to create any food wastage. Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.